In this section, we're going to be covering two primary focuses. The first is going to be the stages of change model. This essentially outlines the various stages individuals go through while they're changing behavior and encoding new behavior to the point where they reach the termination stage, where the previous unproductive behaviors are no longer an issue. The next thing that we're going to be discussing is the neuroscience or neurobiology of behavior change. Now, I know sometimes people can get a little bit intimidated when they hear fancy technical jargon words like neuroscience or neurobiology, but I promise you that we're not going to get too deep in the weeds. We're just going to cover some really basic fundamentals that will actually really help your understanding and your application of a lot of the principles and a lot of the tactics that we will give you during the remainder of this course. Okay, so we will dive right in. And again, I'm going to keep everything as simplistic as I can, and we're going to create as much practical applications so that there's a little bit better understanding, and therefore you can implement it more effectively in your own situation. Starting off with the stages of change model. There are different rates that people might go through, but generally speaking, these are things that occur over time as opposed to an acute instance. Someone maybe has a near-death experience, maybe they lose a family member, maybe they have a child, maybe they just have some weird realization. Whatever it might be, that individual makes immediate and abrupt change and never goes back to their old behavior. Now, that is incredibly rare. Although it does happen, it is incredibly rare. And it's important to note that when we are trying to make concepts and techniques more viable for a broader audience, we should not be basing our outcomes on outliers. Okay, so for instance, if you jumped out of an airplane and your parachute had a 5% deployment rate, those are not good odds. Now, let's say there's a guy who jumped out of the airplane with that exact same parachute with the exact same odds and has deployed. Is that a good strategy to say, hey, mine worked, it worked for me, therefore it's going to work for most people? Well, no, because we know that 95% of the time, the parachute's not going to deploy. So instead of taking extreme cases or outliers, ideally what we want to do is we want to take the most generalizable cause, or we want to take all of the aggregated data and say, okay, what is applicable to most people in most circumstances? Now, the first stage is the pre-contemplation stage. Okay, this is where there's no intention to take action in the foreseeable future. Now, generally, when we're talking about the research on this model, that's looking into the future roughly about 6 months. So within the next 6 months, there's not really any strong impetus to change. So an example of this could be some guy, he's going to college and he's part of a fraternity, and he's going out and partying every weekend with his fraternity friends. He's having a bunch of drinks and he's just having a great old time, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. So, no intention to change, he's having a blast. Then we move into the second stage, which is the contemplation stage. This is where an individual actually develops the intent to take action somewhere within the next 6 months. So, in this, again, hypothetical example, we can say that individual goes to his doctor for his annual checkup. They start asking all these generalized kind of health questions, and they get to the question about alcohol consumption. This guy says he drinks about 40 to 60 drinks a week, on the weekend when he's partying with his friends. And obviously that sets off a couple of potential alarm bells in the doctor's mind. So he starts asking him some follow-up questions. Then he says, hey, you know what? This is probably going to be an issue. If you don't stop this, you're young right now, you're generally pretty healthy, but these things, these behaviors are known to create very serious health outcomes down the road if they persist. Okay, these are chronic health conditions that stem from consistent lifestyle issues. So it gives that individual a little bit of a moment to pause and say, hey, you know what? Oh, he's kind of right. And, it knocks a little bit of sense into him. Then you move into the next stage, which is the preparation stage. This is where there's intent to take action and the general development of a very basic plan of action. So because the doctor, got all this information and the guy was saying, hey, you know what? I have 40 to 60 drinks a week. The doctor was a little bit concerned. So he wrote a requisition form and said, hey, I want you to come back in a month. The guy comes back in 1 month. And at that point, that's when he gets the bad news. Hey, your liver enzymes are elevated. Your kidney isn't necessarily where we want it to be in terms of functionality. You've got all these other issues that are precursors to future illnesses. So at that point, he's like, okay, this is clearly something that's become an issue and I need to take action. So he develops a very basic plan of action. All right, now the next stage is the action phase. So this is where the individual has made specific and overt behavior change within the last 6 months. Now, it should be noted that this is a start, but this does not mean that the behaviors are now automated. It does not mean that he has overcome any previously negative encoding behaviors or any of that things. It just means that he has actually decided to take action and now he's doing something about it. Okay, so to continue on with this example, let's say he hires a coach and the coach looks at some lifestyle variables, he looks at his general fitness, he looks at his nutrition and a whole host of other things, and they construct some sort of a plan, some sort of dietary intervention, some sort of training or physical activity intervention, and some sort of lifestyle intervention where they can modify some of the behaviors so that you can create the best outcomes for him. And then you shift into the maintenance stage. Now, this is where you're working to prevent relapse of the previous undesirable behaviors. This stage can last anywhere between 6 months and 5 years. Now, that is a pretty big gap. So why is there such a huge gap when all of the previous examples, for the most part, were around the 6-month mark? Well, the longer that a behavior has been encoded, the more difficult it is to change. So for instance, if someone gains 5 pounds over the summer holidays or 10 pounds over the summer holidays, he's probably adopted some undesirable behaviors and that's caused him to gain a little bit of weight. However, it was only over the summer, so it's only a couple of months. Changing some of those behaviors probably not going to be that difficult in terms of changing their behavior. Another thing that I should mention is that it's not just a linear process. It's not like you're getting better and you're developing more skills, you're learning more, and you're just constantly making progress. It's more of like a wave, right? Now, if you zoom out far enough, yes, it will look like a linear progression. So we're not necessarily saying that in the maintenance phase, you're always going forward. There might be periods where an individual's doing really well, they're training 5 days a week, they're on point with their diet, but then they go on vacation. Maybe they gain a little bit of weight, maybe they get injured, or maybe they have, they lose their job and they're not able to train as much because they have to spend a lot more time looking for a new job. So maybe they go from 5 days a week to only training 3 days a week. So there's variability and undulation that naturally occurs because that's life and life happens. Now, after the maintenance stage, we move into the termination stage. So at this point, there is zero temptation and the desired behavior is now automatic and it's become habituated, okay? So this is actually something I've had a lot of personal experience with. It's something I've experienced personally. It's something I've also experienced with many, many, many of my clients. So the most recent one actually was last week. I received a text message and I'm gonna share the one that I got recently. So I get a text message. My client says, hey, I was out with my friends the other night and we were just having some drinks, we were eating, and I was actually really good. I didn't really go off my diet, I didn't really want to. Everything was great, I was having a blast. And then they decided they wanted to get dessert, and they asked me if I wanted dessert, and I said no, and I meant it, right? So the reason why that was so relevant is because this particular individual struggled immensely with food cravings, struggled immensely, specifically with sweets and sugary foods. This was something that they had been struggling with probably for the last 10 to 15 years of their life. They would binge and they would do so in private and they were so ashamed of it. There was all of this stuff that was kind of built around it. Yet they're out with their friends and they say no. And the last part I think is the most important part when they said, and I meant it. They didn't want it and they meant it. And then they reached out to me and said, it was funny because after that, I was trying to think back. I was like, man, when was the last time I actually went and wanted sweets? And they were like, it's been at least 3 or 4 months. And they didn't realize it at the moment. It's not like they were struggling throughout this entire period and then one day it was just like, okay, you're done and you never need to worry about it again. It was a gradual process because the whole time they might have cravings, but because of the skills, because of the education, their understanding of the process, they learn to, I don't want to say ignore their feelings because it's not quite accurate, but it's sufficient enough for this conversation to say kind of ignore that and just say, hey, no, I'm going to stick to what I said I was going to do. So they stand with their commitments, they implement the skills, they understand why they're doing it, and they understand the process is there. But those feelings, those cravings were still there the entire time. And they don't just dissipate like that. Right? It takes a long time for those feelings, that encoded emotional behavior and the psychological sort of compulsions to kind of sort of fade into the distance. And a lot of my clients have had the exact same wins. And one of the reasons why it's such a monumental milestone is because for many people, they have been in pain for years. They have struggled with cravings for years. They have struggled with body image issues for years. They never thought that they could ever get past it. Yet here they are, genuinely in a different headspace. They have a better physique, better health, and they genuinely are over this massive obstacle that had been weighing on them for so long. And once you realize that, it's such a huge moment, because then you start to wonder, I wonder what else I could do. I wonder what else I'm not doing because I don't believe in myself. And that is very empowering. For a lot of people, it gives them this really strong sense of agency over their lives, where they say, I can do these things. Maybe I should try and run that marathon. Maybe I should try and, enter a bodybuilding competition or a powerlifting competition or whatever it is. It gives them an immense sense of confidence. It boosts their self-efficacy. It really reinforces their internal locus of control. And locus of control is something we're going to get into a little bit later on in this module. But these are incredibly positive things that accompany the termination stage. And it's not, like I said, it's not this one day where you just realize, oh, it's done. It's usually, it kind of stops or it fades into the distance, but you don't really notice it because you're so used to just focusing on those behaviors, which is exactly what you need to do. And then you have this situation or circumstance that actually makes you realize that you no longer are controlled by these issues anymore. So I kind of wanted to share that story because, again, it's such a profound milestone for many, many people, because it really does give you that sense of self-efficacy and that sense of agency that, man, this is something I struggle with, and I got over it. And that's really, really important to understand, because again, this is coming from your perspective.